Hello, and welcome to Will's Infinite Library. I'm Will, and this is my Infinite Library. I wanted to catch you up on what I've been reading lately, so this is kind of a January wrap-up video and a little bit of bonus content. So let's just go ahead and get started with the bonus content. So I wanted to talk about this book, Inkblood Sister Scribe, which I did not read in January. I read over the summer when I was kind of on a hiatus from Booktube. So I wanted to catch you up on that now. And I forgot to talk about it in my last video. I really enjoyed this one. I wasn't sure, but like it sounded good to me. It was a really great blend of contemporary and fantasy, which is one of my favorite genre mashups of all time. The writing itself was beautiful. It had a really great mix of plot and character. And my only complaint really was that it does shift perspectives a bit. And it would always be like right when I'm getting into one of the characters, like, oh, I really like this character. I want to see what's going to happen to her next. And then it would shift to the other sister or to someone else. And I would be a little annoyed about it. But that's just a personal pet peeve of mine. Not a fault of the book at all. And I would say this book it's very like about bookish magic. So it's a little bit reminded me of Sorcery of Thorns, but a bit more longer and complex. And I would recommend it for fans of The Magicians if you like that series. And also, I think it would be great for people who like wanted to like the Starless Sea and liked the vibes, but were like, there's not enough plot here for me. It's all vibes. So you get similar bookish magic vibes here, but you get them in this tight plot with these great sister characters. It's kind of a family mystery. The magic system itself is cool and involves books. And there's like not a conspiracy, but like a mystery, I guess, that takes you all around from Antarctica to the US and everywhere in between. So that's really cool. And I would recommend, if it sounds interesting to you, picking it up, or I can lend you my copy if I see you in the near future or in the distant future, who knows. So that's Inkblood Sister Scribe, and we will now get on to what I actually read in January. How's about that? So first up was Sterlingkov Gold. I started it at the end of last year and finished it in the beginning of January. I talked about it in my last video, so I'll link back to it here so you can take a look at that if you're interested, but just mentioning that I did read it in January. Next up was another book that I talked about in my last video, Appleseed by Matt Bell. So I had started it a little bit, but I hadn't gotten very far. So now I've finished it. I want to talk a little bit more about it. I struggled a bit to get into it, and I think a lot of that was the language. It's written in kind of I would say like a classic way, I guess, that feels like it could have been written 50 years ago. So the writing is good, it's strong, but it feels a bit overly formal to me personally in a lot of places. I like really casual narration, and that's what really clicks with me. So again, just a personal preference, no fault of the writing itself. I think it is well written and just a bit more traditional than things I'd read recently, such as Sterlingkov Gold, which is the complete opposite and was like too experimental for me in the writing style. There is a lot about this book to love. There are 3 plot lines, like I mentioned in my last video, going from the 1800s all the way up to, I think, like 2000 years from now or something like that. It deals with like futuristic technology, a twist on the creation myth, and a glimpse into the future of humanity. A love for nature, and there's a lot of genre-bending kind of twists. My only real gripe with it was that there's such a like strong eco message throughout it, which is important and like at the heart of the book. But it feels a bit heavy-handed at times, and like it's beating you over the head with this message that humans are terrible. Anything we do is going to ruin the earth, which is true in a lot of ways. But it was to the point where I found myself like screaming at the book halfway through, like, if humans are that bad, just like wipe them all out, and like in the book, we're done, we're good. Humans were bad, they're gone now. So that was just kind of my personal feeling about it. And then it is kind of a big journey. And I was really drawn to the technology and the futurism in the 2 future-based stories. And I kind of found myself wishing that the character that's in the past wasn't there because why? Because it just didn't tie in as much to the other two. The other two were directly related. a lot of overlap, and that one just didn't. Like thematically it did, and like maybe it did in some way that I didn't quite grasp, but I feel like it would have been a lot tighter and a stronger focused narrative if it had focused on the two future stories. Those were the two that had a lot more movement in them too. Like they were going somewhere, they were telling you a story, you're curious to find out what's going to happen next. And in the past, when it was like these two brothers planting apple trees, so there were like cool and interesting things that happened there. There was some mythology that was woven in there that came back in the future, kind of, but like kind of. It wasn't like a strong like this is the same character from that time or this is their descendant or whatever. It wasn't quite like that. The other thing I wanted to say though is that the future parts were really cool. They were really unique and imaginative in the futuristic technology and where the world is, which I loved about it because I love like zooming way out and thinking about like our place in the universe and where we're headed, where we'll be in a time that we can't really imagine right now. Like what if we do try to imagine, what would it look like? And it kind of takes us there to this distant future. And in that sense, it reminded me a bit of the three body problem and just this kind of like mind-blowing, really creative, imaginative technology that feels more like it could happen because it's so beyond what we could think of doing right now that it's like, oh yeah, like we probably will be at a point that we couldn't predict now. So I thought that was really cool too. So that is Appleseed by Matt Bell. And then the next book I read, I also mentioned briefly in my last video, but I hadn't read it yet. Practical Demonkeeping by Christopher Moore. Christopher Moore is an author I hear about all the time that I always want to read and I never do. And I picked up some of his books recently, and this was his first book. So I picked that up to start because it introduces a lot of the characters. They're not all like directly related, but I've heard a lot of the characters come back, so it's good to start kind of chronologically. And this book, Practical Demonkeeping, was written in the early 90s, and it took me a bit to get into it. I always say that with pretty much every book because I think that's just a personal barrier is getting into a book for me. But it took me a bit to get into it because there were some early 90s isms. There was some like pretty, I won't say blatant actually. There was some like passive like racism and homophobia that was just kind of like, I don't think we talk like this anymore. Like this isn't okay. And I put it down because it really bothered me. And then I picked it up again and was like, well, like just trying to kind of justify it so I can get through the book. Like it was kind of more passive. It was like side notes about things or just the way something was presented. It wasn't like making a negative statement or something, but it was just kind of implying things that like was just kind of the culture at the time, which sucked. But yeah, it was a product of its time. Let's say that this book is a product of its time. That got a lot less, and like I didn't notice it anymore after the first, I don't know, like really early on, like the first 10th of the book or something. I saw some of these comments and I was like, and then that just went away. So that was good. That was promising. And the story picked up. I started to enjoy it. It's a really humorous story about this guy and his demon that come into this small town, and hilarity ensues essentially. There's a huge cast of characters with a crazy plot, and the book is really adventurous, but more than anything, it's humorous. This is a humor book, I would say. It didn't make me laugh out loud, but most books don't. It takes a lot to kind of like catch me off guard and make me laugh out loud. But it had a lighthearted tone throughout that I think categorizes it strongly as humor. It made it fun. And more than anything, it reminded me of the works of Daniel Clowes, who was a graphic novelist, and wrote a bunch of graphic novels about kind of small towns that were really quirky and had a quirky cast of characters to the point where the characters themselves are like a conglomeration that makes the town the real main character, and the people are just like tiny pieces of this kind of macrocosm of the town itself in making it up. And this book felt a lot like that. There were tons of characters, very short sections. So though it did jump around, it bothered me less because they were so frequently switching characters that I felt like I was seeing from all of their eyes at the same time. And I think that's what kind of bothers me about when books switch perspectives, is that if it goes for a long time before switching, by the time it switches, I feel like I'm kind of seeing something completely different, or seeing something that doesn't quite align with what I saw from the other character. And then this one, it jumps so much that it's like, okay, now we're seeing through this eyes, now we're seeing through that eyes, and there's kind of a progression there, and you could see two events that happen at the same time without jumping in time as much. If that makes any sense. I don't think I explained it very well, but like maybe it makes sense. I don't know. So that's practical demon keeping. And then here's the big surprise. I read and finished The Name of the Wind, which I never thought I would do. I wanted to give a quick shout out to Sarah Burke 5840, who commented on my last video when I mentioned I DNF'd this book and said she enjoyed it. And I've heard a lot of people enjoyed it, but that was just enough. Like hearing from one more person, like, I enjoyed it. I'm like, okay, there's something here I'm not getting. Let me dive back in. And it was enough of a push to get me through the rest of the book, which I had already read about 60% of, so it wasn't that much further. I just had to do it. Overall, what I want to say about this book is that the thing that I compare it to the most is Legends and Lattes. It's very quiet and episodic. Each chapter, there's a new problem that gets presented and then it gets resolved. And a lot of chapters are very, very, very quiet. Like it'll be like, Quoth has no money. Here's how he gets money. Then he spent it. And then so the next chapter will be like, he didn't have money because he spent it. And in the last chapter, here's how he got more money. And it gets a bit frustrating because he talks about how poor he is all the time. And then he'll like come into tons of money through like something that he does. And you'll be like, oh, now he's set for the rest of the book. But then he like somehow manages to spend it in that chapter. And you're like, oh my God, how did he do that again? It's like something that he needs. You're like, did you need it? Did you need this exact thing at this time in this way? Couldn't you have like budgeted a little more? So I was kind of screaming at him about money the whole time, but it moved the plot along kind of, which is my other point about this book. That was my main gripe with it, was that there's not really a central plot at all. There's not really a journey that the character goes on. It's just like this happened in this chapter and then that happened in that chapter. He met a girl that he liked. He spent all his money. He got beat up. He went to school, and it doesn't really progress at all. There's kind of, and that's why I think I was mostly disappointed, because when I picked this book up originally over the summer and started reading it, I was in the mood for some like great high fantasy epic adventure, and really diving into the magic, because magic is my favorite thing about fantasy. So I really expected that from it. And like The Name of the Wind even implies that like that's how the magic system is based on names, and like the whole book is going to be about the name of the wind. But magic barely is mentioned. It gets mentioned a little more as he gets to the school later in the book, but it isn't central at all. It's not something that's used often. It's pretty regulated in this society. Most people don't know about it, or if they do, they don't know how it works. There's people who talk about kind of having misconceptions about magic. So I was sad that it wasn't in there. And there was also this kind of promise that it would be this rich mythology about these gods, and like this mystery around the gods, and like how they had a hand in his parents' death, and he wants to find out more about them, to learn about them, and I don't know, get revenge on them or something. I'm not really sure what he wants to do if you just find out more about them, essentially. And they're not really mentioned at all, ever, except for like once in a while it's like, oh yeah, I wonder what's happening with those gods. They're a mystery. And then like 200 pages will go by and I'll be like, I should probably figure out what's going on with those gods. And then like more like money problems and stuff. And then, oh yeah. So like it just feels like something that wasn't super heavily edited. And then like going back at the end, a copy editor was like, you should probably add in more mentions of this, because we like kind of sold the book based on these premises. So this is just me like nitpicking, but what I really want to say about this book is that I get it now. I don't love it, but I was able to enjoy it because of that realization I had that like I expected these epic things out of it. I expected magic out of it. Those were my expectations. And it turned out to be very quiet instead. And once I realized that it's a quiet, cozy fantasy, I was able to enjoy it one chapter at a time and to kind of get lost in it in a different way than I expected to get lost in it. I expected to be lost in the world of the book itself, but I got lost in one chapter at a time and got lost in these like quiet, everyday things that I could relate to more than lose myself in. Like with fantasy, often it's like these big ideas that you can't, like the gods or magic, that you can't really relate to one-to-one from your day-to-day life, but it was more things that you can relate to day-to-day, which I think is why a lot of people enjoy this book, because they enjoy the cozy fantasy aspect of it. For me personally, the reason why I enjoyed Legends and Lattes more was because there was a central goal. There was this cafe that she wanted to make, and that moved things along. So she'd make a new kind of coffee in one chapter, and then she'd make and then update the sign, like, I made a new coffee. And then in the next chapter, there would be like a new addition to the cafe, or a new pastry, or a new employee. And in this one, there's not really anything that builds on itself. It's just scattered moments, it kind of feels like. And I think that, again, that's what a lot of people probably like about it, because it does feel like a very realistic fantasy in that way too, because that's more how life is than fiction, right? Like life is all these things, and we try to like make sense of them and piece them together and tell a story, but they often don't really add up. They're just things that happen to us. And that's how this book is. It's just things that happen to the main character, kind of. And I'm kind of curious to see how the series continues, but I doubt I'll read it. We'll see. We'll see. Let me know in the comments below what you think of The Name of the Wind. And if you've read the sequel, I'd love to hear, like, kind of like, is it the same? Like, I read this plot summary before making this video to see if I wanted to read the second book, and I was like, I feel like it's non-committal enough in the synopsis of what happens that probably it's similar to this book, where it doesn't really follow a trajectory through like a normal plot trajectory. So let me know in the comments below if you've read it, what you think. I'd love to hear from you. So that's what I read in January. I'm not really sure what I'm going to be reading in February. I still want to read through my physical TBR a bit, so we'll see what comes up out of that, and if I get curious and try to read something new that's not on that list. So I'd love to hear from you, what you've been reading, what you read in January, what you're reading in February, what you thought of any of these books. And with that, I'll let you get back to your reading. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, and I will see you next time.